Morning I found out my life was built on a lie. I was making coffee in a kitchen I'd spent 2 years picking out the right subway tile for. I remember that detail because it seems so absurd now. All those Saturdays at Home Depot, holding up sample cards in the light, asking my husband if he liked the pale grey or the cream. He always said, "Whatever you want, babe." I thought that was sweetness. I know now it was indifference. He had other things on his mind, other places he'd rather be. I was 31. I ran a small but growing financial planning practice in Austin, Texas. Built from nothing, just me and a borrowed conference room for the first 6 months. My father had died 3 years earlier, leaving me his work ethic and his stubbornness and not much else. I was proud of what I had made. I thought my husband was proud of me too. We'd been married for years, no kids yet, though we talked about it the way you talk about a vacation you keep meaning to book. Someday, when things settle down. The usual lies people tell themselves when something in the background isn't quite right, but you can't name it yet. The doorbell rang at 7:10 on a Tuesday morning. I almost didn't answer it. I had a client call at 8 and I was still in my robe. The woman on my porch was somewhere in her late 60s, maybe 70. She was thin in the way that suggests illness rather than discipline. She had a walker, one of those light aluminum ones with tennis balls on the back legs, and she was gripping it with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes were sharp and dark and completely certain of what they were about to do. "Are you the wife?" she asked, just like that. Not my name, not an apology for the hour. "Are you the wife?" "I'm sorry," I said. "Are you married to him, the man who lives here?" I said yes. I told her my husband's name. She closed her eyes for just a second, like she was confirming something she'd already known. Then she opened them and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as exhausted mercy. "I need to come inside," she said. "I don't have a lot of time." And I mean that literally. The doctors say weeks, maybe less. I let her in. I don't know why. Maybe because she was clearly sick and clearly not a threat. Maybe because something in her voice told me that whatever she'd come to say, I needed to hear it sitting down. She lowered herself into the armchair by the window, the one my mother had given us as a wedding gift, and she set her walker to the side and folded her hands in her lap. I sat across from her on the couch, still holding my coffee mug, still in my robe. "My name is Dolores," she said. "I live over in Round Rock. My daughter lives in Austin. She's lived here for 5 years. She paused. "With your husband's help?" The coffee mug was suddenly very heavy in my hands. "My daughter's name is not important right now," Dolores said. "What's important is that she and your husband have been together for 4 years. Since before you were married, actually. He didn't end it. He just kept both." She looked out the window for a moment, as if the yard were easier to face than I was. "She has a little boy. He's 2 years old. Your husband was in the delivery room. He held that baby the first night of his life." The room didn't tilt or spin. That's what people say in stories. The room spun. For me, it just went very still, like everything had stopped breathing. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. My voice sounded like someone else's. Dolores looked back at me. "Because I'm dying," she said simply. "Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 4 months ago. And I spent those 4 months trying to convince my daughter to come clean, to end it, to stop waiting for a man who was never going to choose her. She wouldn't listen. So I'm here because when I go, I will not carry this with me. I'm not dying as someone who kept a secret." She reached into her coat pocket and set an envelope on my coffee table. "Everything you need to know is in there." I stared at the envelope, white, letter-sized, already open. "Is she going to keep the baby?" I asked. I don't know why that was the first thing that came out. "She loves that child," Dolores said. "Whatever else she's done, that part is real." She pushed herself up from the armchair with visible effort, got her hands back on the walker. She was leaving, just like that. She delivered what she came to deliver, and now she was leaving. "I'm sorry," she said at the door. "I know this isn't the morning you were planning." She was gone before I thought to ask for her number. I sat in that quiet house for a long time after. The coffee went cold, my phone lit up twice, probably my assistant confirming the 8 o'clock call. I didn't move. Then I picked up the envelope. Inside were photographs. My husband with a woman, close in the way that people who know each other's bodies are close, comfortable, and unguarded. A little boy with dark curly hair and my husband's jaw. A birthday party. Balloons, a smash cake. My husband down on one knee in front of the high chair, laughing with his whole face. The kind of laugh I saw maybe once a year. There was also a lease agreement. An apartment in South Austin. The tenant of record was the woman, my husband's other family. But the guarantor, the person who'd signed to say he'd cover the rent if she couldn't, was my husband. His signature. His phone number listed in the emergency contact field. I knew that signature. I processed contracts every day. I was a financial planner. I knew what a document meant when it had your husband's name at the bottom. I put everything back in the envelope. I took a shower. I got dressed. And instead of calling my therapist or my sister or my best friend, I called the one person I trusted most, with numbers and legal exposure, my accountant, a woman I'd worked with since I first hung my license, who knew my books better than I did. I need to meet with you today, I told her, not about taxes. Her name was Bonnie, and she'd been in this business for 35 years, and she did not rattle easily. But when I laid out the photographs and the lease on her desk an hour later, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Is there anything financial you want me to look at?" "Yes," I said, "everything." We started with the joint account. My husband and I had combined finances when we married. His insistence, actually, which I thought at the time was romantic, a sign of commitment. "Let's really merge our lives," he'd said. I remember thinking it was mature of him. What Bonnie found in the next 3 hours was not romantic. He had set up a linked account I'd never seen, a second checking account attached to our joint savings, authorized under a business entity he'd registered in his name alone 18 months ago. The entity was called something deliberately vague, RVH Consulting, LLC. It had a registered agent in Delaware and no actual website, no actual clients. The transfers were small at first, 200 here, 350 there. The kind of amounts that don't trigger alerts, that get lost in the noise of regular spending. But they'd been going on for 2.5 years. When Bonnie added them up, the number on her legal pad made me put my hand flat on the desk to steady myself. Over $60,000. Gone. Moved into an account I'd never known existed. Spent on a life I'd never known was happening. "The lease," Bonnie said carefully. "The apartment." "He was paying it," I said. "He was paying it with this." She tapped the column of transfers. The thing people don't understand about financial betrayal is that it hits differently than emotional betrayal. The affair was a wound to my heart. The money was a wound to my intelligence. I had spent 4 years building a practice that helped families protect their financial futures, and my own husband had been running a shadow account under my nose for 30 months. I hadn't noticed. I, who caught errors in my clients' spreadsheets that their CPAs missed, hadn't noticed. I sat in Bonnie's office until nearly 5 in the evening. By the time I left, I had a clear picture of what had happened and a cold, clean decision forming in the center of my chest. I was not going to cry in a parking lot. I was not going to call him screaming. I was not going to give him the chance to gaslight me, to explain it away, to turn this into a conversation about my trust issues, or my work schedule, or whatever narrative he'd already prepared. I was going to do what I did for my clients when they needed to protect themselves. I was going to build a case. I called my attorney that evening from the driveway of my own house, sitting in my car, watching the lights on inside. He'd gotten home before me. He was in there right now, probably watching television, completely unaware that his wife had spent the day dismantling everything he thought he'd hidden. My attorney's name was Rosalind. She'd been practicing family law in Austin for 20 years. I'd referred clients to her. I knew her work. "I need to talk to you," I said when she answered. "Not as a referral, for me." There was a brief pause. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "First thing, bring everything you have." I walked into my house. My husband was on the couch, exactly where I'd pictured him, a game on the TV. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, long day?" "The longest," I said. I went upstairs to change. I was very calm. I was the calmest I'd ever been in my life, and that calmness was the most frightening thing I'd ever felt, because I recognized it. It was the way I felt right before I had a very difficult conversation with a client. The way I felt when I knew something they didn't, and I was about to tell them. The next 3 weeks, I moved with the kind of precision I usually reserved for year-end audits. Rosalind filed a petition for divorce and an emergency motion to freeze all joint assets before my husband knew anything was happening. The grounds included financial fraud, the transfers, the unauthorized business entity, the documentation Bonnie had compiled, as well as the grounds the state of Texas allowed regarding the breakdown of the marriage. On the morning the papers were served, I was already at the office. My assistant called me at 9:15 to say my husband had called the front desk 3 times. I asked her to hold all calls from that number. He showed up at the office at noon. I watched him on the security camera at the front desk, watched the moment he understood from the receptionist's face that he was not going to be let back. He stood there for a moment, that same jaw I'd recognized in the photographs of his little boy, and then he left. His attorney contacted Rosalind 2 days later. He wanted to negotiate. He wanted to talk about the business entity, claim it was a legitimate tax structure. Rosalind sent back the transaction records and the lease agreement and a very polite letter explaining that we looked forward to the discovery process. He stopped negotiating after that. In Texas, community property law meant that the money he'd moved was subject to division or restitution given the circumstances. The forensic accountant Rosalind brought in confirmed that the transfers constituted fraud upon the community estate. The final settlement wasn't everything. It never is. But I got the house, I got the retirement accounts, I got the documented restitution of the transferred funds. He got a 6-month spousal support obligation that Rosalind made sure felt like a message. What I didn't expect was what happened with Dolores. 6 weeks after she'd sat in my armchair and blown up my life, I got a call from a hospital in Round Rock. She'd listed my number with the nursing staff, they said, as an emergency contact. Her daughter was not reachable. I went. She was smaller than I remembered in the way that people get smaller in hospital beds, but she recognized me. She turned her head and reached out her hand, and when I took it, it felt like paper over wire. "She threw me out," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "When she found out I talked to you. When the news got around about the papers being filed." She swallowed. She said I ruined everything, that she'd been waiting 4 years. That he would have left you eventually. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. "My grandchild," she said. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying in a way that wanted comfort. She was just stating a fact the way you state a fact when you've made peace with it. He's 2. He doesn't understand any of this. Whatever she's done, whatever he's done. That baby is still in that apartment, and now I won't be here. I held her hand for a long time. She died 4 days later. The nursing staff told me I was the only person who came. I drove back to Austin in the dark and sat in my driveway for an hour. My house was quiet and mine. The divorce would be final in 90 days. I had survived the thing I had feared most, not just the betrayal, but the dismantling of what I'd thought was my life, and I was intact. Angry, yes. Lonely, yes, but intact. What I could not stop thinking about was that little boy. He was 2 years old, he had my husband's jaw and probably Dolores's dark eyes, and he had done nothing wrong. He was living in an apartment that had been paid for with money stolen from me, which was its own kind of strange knot that I didn't know how to untangle. His grandmother was dead. His father was in the middle of a legal battle and about to have a lot less money and a lot less freedom than he'd expected. His mother had chosen bitterness over honesty. None of that was his fault. I thought about what Dolores had said when I'd first asked why she was telling me all of this. "Because I don't want to die carrying this," she'd said. She'd chosen her own conscience over protecting her daughter's secret, and in doing so she'd also, without saying it out loud, put something in my hands. Not just information. A question. What was I going to do with the part of this story that wasn't about me? I talked to Bonnie. She looked at me over her reading glasses for a long time when I finished explaining what I wanted to do. "You understand this is completely voluntary," she said. "You have no legal obligation here." "I know," I said. "And this woman, the mother, she doesn't know your identity." And she won't, I said. I want it anonymous, through a foundation or a gift fund. Whatever structure makes it cleanest. Bonnie knew an attorney who worked with charitable vehicles. We set up a small donor-advised fund, the kind that lets you grant money anonymously to specific recipients or institutions. Every 3 months, a grant went to the childcare centre where the little boy was enrolled. Not enough to raise questions, enough to make sure the bill was covered, that he had a stable place to go every day, that whatever else was happening around him, that part of his life was steady. His mother never knew where it came from. The director of the childcare centre was told only that it was an anonymous scholarship fund for families demonstrating financial need. She probably thought it was a local donor or a church group. It wasn't. I never told anyone except Bonnie. Not my sister, not my friends, not my therapist. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed an audience. It wasn't a performance of virtue. It was just a thing I decided to do with a small portion of the money that had been taken from me, redirect it to the person least responsible for all of it. The divorce was final on a Thursday in November. I marked the occasion by going to my favourite taco place alone and eating chips and queso and reading a novel for 2 hours, which is the most aggressively normal celebration I could imagine and exactly what I wanted. My practice grew that year. Word had gotten out, the way word always gets out in a professional community, that I had navigated the personal financial fraud situation and come through it with my firm intact. Clients came to me who were going through their own complicated situations. Divorce, estate disputes, discovering a spouse had hidden assets. I knew how to listen to those stories now in a way I hadn't before. I knew what it felt like to have the ground shift under something you'd believed was solid. I hired another advisor the following spring, a young woman 2 years out of her CFP exam, sharp and meticulous, the kind of careful that comes from having worked hard for what you have. I took her to coffee on her first day, and I told her almost none of what I've told you here, because it wasn't the time for it. But I did tell her one thing. I told her to note every account, every line, every signature. To never let anyone, no matter how much she loved them or trusted them, manage her money without her full visibility. Not because everyone is a liar, but because love is not the same thing as safety, and she needed to know the difference. She looked at me like she was filing it away somewhere important. I went home that evening to the house that was mine. The kitchen with the subway tile I'd spent 2 Saturdays choosing, the armchair by the window where a dying woman had sat and told me the truth, the driveway where I'd made calls that changed the direction of everything. I thought about Dolores sometimes, about what it cost her to come to my door. Her daughter had not forgiven her. She had died in a hospital room with a near stranger holding her hand. By any measure, she had lost something enormous in those last weeks. And yet when I'd held her hand near the end, there had been something in her face that I can only describe as settled, like a person who has done the thing they needed to do and can now put it down. I understood that, not perfectly, not all at once, but I was starting to. There are things that happen to you that you spend a long time thinking are about the person who did them to you. The betrayal, the lies, the money. All of it feels like a story with someone else at the center. And you're just the person it happened to. But at some point, if you're paying attention, you realize the story is actually about what you do next, who you decide to be once you know what you know. I decided to be someone who kept her eyes open, who built something real, who took care of her own house without letting anyone else hold the key she didn't know about. And sometimes, not always, not loudly, someone who made sure a little boy could go to preschool in the morning, even though none of what happened was his fault. That's the part I don't talk about. But it's the part I think about the most. I still think about the moment Dolores sat down in that armchair, the way she gripped her walker, the way she looked at me like she already knew how much it was going to hurt, and she was going to say it anyway. People talk about betrayal like it's one thing, one event, one moment where everything breaks. But what I lived through wasn't a single break. It was a series of discoveries, each one peeling back another layer of something I thought I knew. The affair was one kind of pain. The money was another. And then there was the third thing, the one nobody talks about, the realization that I had all the tools to see it and I hadn't looked, not because I was naive, because I trusted, and I had confused trust with willingness to go blind. I don't think that confusion is weakness. I think it's something most of us do, especially with the people we've built our lives around. But Dolores didn't let herself stay in that confusion. She was dying, her body was failing. Her own daughter had stopped speaking to her, and she still chose to do the right thing. She chose honesty when silence would have been so much easier. When silence would have cost her nothing. That kind of integrity doesn't come from a rule or a fear of consequence. It comes from somewhere deeper, some internal accounting that says, I will not leave this earth having kept a harmful secret. I will not let my love for my daughter outweigh my responsibility to the truth. I've thought a lot about what it means to be that kind of person. To have that kind of clarity about right and wrong and act on it even when it destroys something you were trying to protect. Dolores lost her daughter in those final weeks. She died in a hospital room without her family around her. By every external measure, doing the right thing cost her everything. And yet when I held her hand near the end, she was at peace in a way I hadn't expected. She had made her decision and she stood behind it, fully, without hedging. That's not something you get from being lucky. That's something you build. It's built from making small, honest choices before the big ones arrive. From training yourself to look clearly at uncomfortable things. From deciding early what kind of person you want to be and then actually being that person when it's hard. What I had to build, what I had to learn, was different. It was the discipline to think clearly when my heart was in chaos. To walk into Bonnie's office and say, look at everything instead of tell me I'm wrong. To call Rosalind and say, I need to protect myself instead of waiting to see if he'd explain it away. I had the knowledge. What I needed was the will to use it, even when using it meant accepting a reality I had not chosen. And then there was the little boy. That part came later, quietly, when the anger had settled enough for me to see past my own wound. He hadn't chosen any of this either, and I had something in my hands. Resources, agency, the ability to do something small and steady and real. And the only question was whether I would let resentment make that decision for me, or whether I would make it myself. I made it myself, not out of forgiveness for his parents, not out of obligation, out of a belief that how you act when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, when the decision is entirely yours. That is who you actually are. Dolores knew who she was, right up to the end. I'm still figuring it out, but I think that's the work. And I think that's enough.